Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey. Being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. Welcome to episode 40 of my historical travel podcast Voyage to go History, where I take you on the most adventurous journeys from the past that continue to shape our view of the world today. In the true story I'm currently telling you, 17-year-old German Georg Forster travels around the world with his father, a naturalist, in the 18th century aboard a sailing ship under the command of Captain James Cook. Right now, our story is unfolding in the remote waters of the South Pacific. The HMS Resolution has just departed Easter Island, Rapa Nui, a barren, mysterious land that left a deep impression on the crew, and is now approaching the Marquesas Islands in search of better provisions and human contact. Georg Forster's travel narrative is written in the language of the 18th century. To make it easier to understand, I have translated it into modern English. His knowledge reflects the mindset of his time, so throughout this podcast I'll occasionally offer additional context and explanations. What happened in the last episode?
In the previous episode, we followed the HMS Resolution as it arrived at Easter Island, Rapa Nui, on March 16, 1774. The crew made several cautious contacts with the islanders, trading for potatoes, bananas, and chickens. Though supplies were limited and of poor quality, they came just in time to ease scurvy and other illnesses on board. Georg Forster observed the harsh living conditions on the island, infertile soil, scarce water, and widespread poverty. Yet the islanders generously shared their meager resources, driven more by curiosity than surplus. Their language, tools, tattoos, and customs showed clear kinship with other Polynesian peoples like those of New Zealand and Tahiti. By March 17th, the ship had left Easter Island, but remained within sight due to weak winds. The toll of the voyage became apparent again. Cook relapsed into illness, and many crew members suffered from heat and fatigue. Although the fresh supplies were minimal, they did bring temporary relief. The final scenes were filled with both exhaustion and rising hope as they set course for the Marquesas Islands.
Thursday, April 7, 1774, Tahuata, Marquesas Islands.
Knowing how poor the health of his crew had become, Captain Cook couldn't allow himself to give up hope of finding some fresh supplies on the island. He ordered the ship to be moved deeper into the bay and went ashore with a selected group of Marines and sailors. They landed beneath the arched cliff to the north, accompanied by Dr. Sparman, Mahane, Georg's father, and Georg himself. A group of islanders, numbering over 100, met them on the rocks, armed with spears and clubs, though they made no move to use them. The landing party approached with many signs of friendship, which the locals seemed to return in their own way. They were asked to sit down, and they complied willingly. Then, the visitors tried to explain the recent incident in the best possible light. They made it clear that the shooting of one of their countrymen had only happened because he had stolen something from them. They said they had come with peaceful intentions, wishing to live as friends, and were mainly there to obtain water, wood, and fresh food. In return, they had nails, axes, and other valuable goods to trade. Their arguments made sense, and the islanders were reassured. They even seemed to believe their fellow islander had deserved his fate. Convinced of this, they led the newcomers trustfully along the shore to a small stream, where the sailors began collecting water and were able to buy a few pieces of fruit. For extra safety, the Marines formed a line and remained under arms to secure the path back to the water. But in the end, all those precautions had proven unnecessary. The people they dealt with were too honest to break the peace they had made, and too good-natured to seek revenge for the death of a man they didn't consider entirely innocent. Trade quickly picked up, and the islanders came down from the mountains with full loads of plantains, bananas, and breadfruit, which they exchanged for small iron items of all kinds. Up to that point, no women had appeared. Most likely, they had fled into the hills at the first sign of trouble. Some of the men were better dressed and armed than the others, which led them to assume these were chiefs or leaders. All the islanders were naked, wearing only a small cloth around their hips. In general, they were tall and well-proportioned. None were clumsy or as corpulent as the higher-ranking Tahitians, nor were they as thin or emaciated as the people of Easter Island. The tattoos, which covered nearly the entire bodies of middle-aged men, made it difficult to clearly see the beauty of their physiques. Among the younger ones who were not yet tattooed, there were remarkably beautiful individuals whose symmetrical features drew admiration. Some could easily have stood beside the masterpieces of ancient sculpture, and would certainly not have looked inferior by comparison. The natural skin tone of these young men was not quite as dark as that of the common people on the Society Islands. The older ones, however, appeared much darker because of the tattoos that extended from head to foot. These decorative patterns were arranged with such precision that the figures on their legs, arms, and cheeks matched perfectly. They never depicted specific animals or plants, but rather consisted of countless dots, curved lines, squares, and chevrons, creating a colorful and striking overall impression. Their faces were generally pleasant, open, and full of life, enhanced by their large, dark eyes. Their hair was also black, curly, and thick, though in some individuals it appeared lighter and more blonde. The beards were usually sparse, likely because of the frequent scarring caused by tattooing, especially around the chin. These tattoos and other forms of ornament seemed to serve, in a way, as a substitute for clothing. Some wore a type of diadem around the head, made of a flat band woven from coconut fibers. On the front of this band were two large round pieces of mother-of-pearl, with the center inlaid with a carved piece of turtle shell. Behind these shield-like decorations rose two plumes of black, glossy rooster feathers, giving the headdress a truly elegant and noble appearance. Others wore round crowns made of small, tightly bound frigate bird feathers. Some had a circular band from which several rows of coconut fiber strands, about 2 inches long and partly dyed black, stood out around the head. In their ears, they sometimes wore two flat oval pieces of light wood, about 3 inches long, that covered the entire ear and were mostly painted white with lime. The chiefs wore a kind of collar that hung down the chest as a decorative piece. It consisted of small pieces of light, cork-like wood glued together with resin to form a semicircle. Rows of bright red seeds, Abrus precatorius, were also attached with resin in lines 2 to 3 inches long. Those who lacked such extravagant ornaments at least wore a string around the neck, with a piece of shell shaped and smoothed into the form of a large tooth. They also valued tufts of human hair, which they tied with cords around their waists, arms, knees, and thighs. While they would eagerly trade away all other types of adornment for small trinkets, they rarely gave up this hair decoration, which they held in especially high regard, even though it was often infested with lice. They likely wore it as a memorial to deceased relatives and honored it just as they honored the dead. Perhaps it was also a trophy taken from defeated enemies. Still, they sometimes forgot all such concerns in the face of a large nail or some other small object that fed their curiosity and desire. After observing the people gathered along the shore, the men made their way into the nearby forest, heading to the spot Captain Cook had chosen. There, they found various species of plants, most of which they already knew from the Society Islands. However, since it didn't seem wise to venture too far inland right away, they stayed in the low-lying, completely uninhabited areas close to the coast. Among the trees, they discovered many square-shaped areas made of neatly laid stones, most of them square as well. As they later learned, these were the foundations of former houses. From this, they concluded that the area had either been abandoned due to certain disadvantages or was only inhabited during specific times of the year. Though they saw no cultivated land, the whole area was forested, in some parts even with good quality timber. The locals allowed them to move about freely and undisturbed. A hill covered with waist-high grass formed a steep, vertical cliff on the seaside, separating the bay from another one farther to the south. On the northern side of this hill, they found clear, fresh spring water, exactly at the spot where the Spanish descriptions had indicated. The water poured out of the rock into a small basin, and from there flowed into the sea. Nearby, a stream came down from the higher mountains, and an even larger one flowed into the center of the bay. This one seemed most suitable for filling the water casks. They discovered a third stream in the northern corner of the bay. The island, therefore, had a fairly abundant water supply, which was highly beneficial for plant growth and human life in this hot climate. Soon after, they returned to the trading area with their botanical findings and began speaking with the locals, who had now completely set aside their mistrust. They even exchanged their weapons for iron tools. All the weapons were made of casuarina wood and consisted either of wooden throwing spears, about 2.4 to 3 meters in length, or of clubs with a thick knob at one end. In the meantime, Captain Cook had succeeded in acquiring some pigs as well as a large quantity of fruit, which they brought back to the ship around midday. On land, the air had been hot, but on board it was cooler, as strong gusts occasionally came down from the mountains, sometimes bringing rain with them. In the afternoon, Georg stayed on board the ship. His father, however, went ashore again with the captain, where he discovered a shabby hut on a small rise. The inhabitants had likely fled, because the two of them had already fired their guns a few times at birds. He therefore placed a few nails on some breadfruit trees next to the hut, and hurried back to the ship with a few new plants. The next morning, 7 canoes from Dominica arrived alongside the ship, while several others from St. Christina rowed up the channel. The canoes from Dominica appeared to belong to the same people they had already met. They brought the same fruits for trade that had been exchanged before. After breakfast, the travelers went ashore and found their friendly acquaintances, the islanders, already waiting on the beach. Among them, they spotted a leader. He wore a cloak made of mulberry bark, crafted in a style similar to Tahitian cloth. He was also adorned with a diadem, a collar, wooden ear ornaments, and tufts of hair. They were told he was the king of the entire island, but as far as they could see, he was not treated with any special honor. He gave Captain Cook some fruit and pigs, remained near the trading area all day, and said his name was Honu. He himself was Heka'ai, which undoubtedly meant the same as Eri in Tahiti, or Eriki in the Friendly Islands. The word Honu means turtle in Tahitian. This suggests that the inhabitants often took their names from animals, much like certain North American peoples. Similarly, Otu, the name of the Tahitian king, meant heron. The man seemed kind-hearted and intelligent. His character was so clearly reflected in his facial features that Mr. Hodges, who drew his portrait, was able to capture him very well. The engraving of it was later printed in Captain Cook's account of the voyage. When the travelers asked for the names of this and the neighboring islands, they were told that St. Christina, Waitahu, Dominica, Hiwarea, and St. Pedro were called Onateo. Because of the similarity in customs, language, and appearance to his own people, Mahene took great pleasure in the locals and spent much of his time in conversation with them. He bought many of their ornaments and showed them customs from his homeland that were unknown here. For example, how to make fire on Tahiti by rubbing dry pieces of hibiscus tiliaceus wood. The islanders listened to him with great attention when he explained things to them in this way. Captain Cook found a large supply of plants at the trading post, as well as some chickens and pigs. He bought everything in exchange for small nails, knives, and pieces of cloth. Red feathers from Tongatabu or Amsterdam were also highly valued here, and much headdress and other decoration was traded for them. That day, they finally saw a woman. She sat within the circle of her fellow islanders and wore, like the women of the Society Islands, a dress made of bark cloth. She was older and hardly distinguishable from a Tahitian woman. The travelers marched nearly 2.8 kilometers along the southern side of the stream. After passing an open area from which the entire harbor could be seen, they entered a dense forest. It contained some fine breadfruit trees, but mainly consisted of ratabauma, or Tahitian nut trees, the species Inocarpus. These nut trees grew to considerable thickness and height. On Tahiti, both types of trees were planted in flat fields, where the heat was milder than on these islands. Eventually, they came upon a kind of dwelling. Compared to the tall houses on the Society Islands, it was merely a poor hut. It stood on a raised stone platform that formed the floor. The stones were neither smooth nor even enough to make a good sleeping place, even though mats were laid over them to soften and make them more comfortable. The walls were made all around of bamboo, set on the stone foundation and tightly bound together. Bamboo was not lacking, but the height was only about 1.5 to 1.8 meters. The roof consisted of thin sticks, covered with leaves from breadfruit and ratabaumi, arranged to form a pointed rectangle. The hut measured approximately 4.7 meters in length and 2.5 to 3.1 meters in width. Since the base was made of stone and raised, it could be assumed that the land was subject to heavy rain and flooding at certain times of year. The few items of furniture they saw included large wooden troughs in which lay pieces of breadfruit moistened with water. Not far from the hut, 3 islanders appeared and, upon request, brought them fresh water from the nearby stream to drink. In return, they gave them a small gift, and then returned to the ship. While boarding, The boat nearly capsized as the surf broke violently against the rocks. But they escaped with nothing more than wet clothes. Mahaina, who had stayed a little longer on land, jumped into the water and swam to the boat, so the group wouldn't have to risk a similar danger again on his account. Dr. Sparman stayed on board in the afternoon to help Georg draw and describe some of the plants they had collected in the morning. Georg's father, however, went with the captain to the southern beach, where they came across a few huts not far from the shore and several men. But not a single woman was to be seen. In this area, the locals had brought the body of their countryman who had been shot. They led the two travelers into the house that had belonged to him. There, they found several pigs, which now passed to his 15-year-old son. They gave the boy various small gifts, in an attempt to ease, at least a little, the loss of his father. When they asked him where his female relatives were, he explained that they were still in the mountains, mourning the dead. This led the visitors to consider whether the enclosures they had noticed on top of the cliffs might be burial grounds of the islanders. The captain bought a large quantity of fruit and several pigs at this place. Even though he was right among the relatives of a man killed by Europeans, not one of them showed the slightest resentment or any desire for revenge.
Saturday, April 9th, 1774, Tahuata, Marquesas Islands.
The next morning, Dr. Sparman accompanied Georg to the watering place, where a lively trade in food was taking place. However, the value of iron goods had dropped noticeably since the ship had anchored in the bay. Small nails, once highly sought after, were now barely in demand, and even larger nails were no longer particularly desired. No one showed any interest in glass beads. In contrast, ribbons, fabrics, and other small items had become even more popular. Especially in exchange for pieces of mulberry bark cloth combined with red feathers from Tongatabu, the islanders were willing to trade even large pigs. The weather that day was extremely hot. Many of the inhabitants carried fans to cool themselves and offered them for sale as well. The fans were quite large and made either from a tough type of bark or from a kind of grass that was intricately woven and partially whitened with ground seashells. Some people used large leaves decorated with feathers in place of parasols, and it turned out that these leaves came from a particular type of palm tree, Corypha umbraculifera. Despite the unbearable heat, the group decided to climb the high mountain, hoping to make some interesting discoveries and be well rewarded for their efforts. They were especially curious about the palisades on the mountain peak. Mr. Patton and two other gentlemen joined the group. They crossed the stream where the crew collected water and followed a footpath heading north, the direction from which they had seen most of the locals descending. At first, the ascent was not too strenuous, as the path led through low hills covered with well-tended banana plantations. Such sights often surprised them, since the trail mainly ran through dense forest made up of fruit and other trees. The cool shade of the forest was very pleasant. From time to time, they saw scattered coconut palms, though these were unusually short, since the conditions in the mountains were unfavorable for them. Coconut palms grew much better in low-lying areas, and even on coral rock where there was hardly any soil at all. Some of the islanders accompanied the group, while others passed them with fruit they were taking down to the trading area. The higher they climbed, the more houses they came across. All stood on raised stone platforms and resembled the hut described earlier. Some appeared newly built and looked remarkably clean inside. However, they could not find the many sleeping places the Spaniards had mentioned, and assumed that the mats on the floor must have been what was meant. The path grew increasingly steep and difficult. In some places, it ran so close to the steep banks of the stream that dangerous drops lay just beside them. They had to cross the stream multiple times. With every rest they took, the hospitable locals brought them fruit and water. The resemblance between the Marquesans and the Tahitians was evident in many ways, especially in their hospitality. Among them, there were neither cripples nor deformed individuals. All were strong, tall, well-proportioned, and extraordinarily agile. These physical qualities were likely also a result of the nature of their land. The mountainous terrain often forced them to climb, and the demanding work in the fields kept them in excellent physical condition. Climbing made them flexible, while labor preserved their lean and balanced physique. About 5 kilometers from the sea, Georg and his companions saw a young woman step out of a house, roughly 30 paces ahead of them. She resembled the women of Tahiti and was of medium height. She wore a garment made of mulberry bark cloth that reached to her knees. But before they could approach her, she fled up the mountainside. The locals made clear gestures urging the visitors to turn back, and they appeared uneasy and displeased when their request was not immediately followed. Georg and Dr. Sparman eventually returned with their collected plants, while Mr. Patton and the others continued about 3 kilometers farther. However, they too found nothing new and did not reach the mountain summit, which still seemed about 5 kilometers away. The path leading there was steeper and more difficult. The soil, up to the point they had reached, appeared fertile, as confirmed by the numerous plantations and fruit trees. Yet along the banks of the stream that ran beside the path, it became clear that this fertile layer was only on the surface. Beneath it lay layers of rock, made up of different types of lava, and grains of white and greenish schorl. The Marquesas Islands resembled the Society Islands in geological structure, and seemed to be volcanic in origin as well. Around the houses they often saw pigs, large chickens, and occasionally rats. In the trees lived several small species of birds similar to those on Tahiti, though less numerous and diverse. Overall, the Marquesas were similar to the Society Islands, but lacked the wide plains and coral reefs that gave the other islands safe harbors. The inhabitants of the Marquesas resembled the Tahitians more than any other people of the South Seas in appearance, customs, and language. However, one major difference lay in their cleanliness. The Tahitians, perhaps the cleanest people in the world, bathed 2 or 3 times a day and washed their hands and face before and after every meal. The Marquesans were less thorough. They bathed and washed less frequently and were more careless in the preparation of their meals. Interestingly, the Marquesans surpassed the Tahitians in one aspect of hygiene. While in Tahiti, human waste was often left in the open along footpaths and eaten by rats, the Marquesans carefully buried it, much like cats do. Although the Tahitians did not regard this habit as unclean, the Marquesan approach was undoubtedly more hygienic. The Marquesas offer a similar variety of fruits and roots as Tahiti, with the exception of the Tahitian apple, spondias. In return, the breadfruit on the Marquesas is larger and more flavorful than anywhere else. When fully ripe, It becomes as soft as fresh cheese and so sweet that it was barely palatable for the visitors. This fruit is the main staple food of the islanders. It is usually roasted over the fire and rarely baked in the ground. After cooking, the locals place the fruits in a wooden trough, the same type used to feed pigs, and let them soak in water. The resulting mash or broth is then scooped out by hand. They also make a fermented dough from the breadfruit and prepare a sour dish from it, similar to the one considered a delicacy for the upper class on Tahiti. The inhabitants of the Marquesas live almost entirely on plant-based food, even though they keep pigs and chickens and occasionally catch fish. Their main drink is water, as coconuts, at least in the regions visited, are relatively scarce. However, since they do have the pepper root, which is also used as a symbol of peace, it is likely they can also prepare the intoxicating drink common on other islands.
The pepper root, botanically known as Piper methysticum, holds great significance in Polynesian culture. Its roots are traditionally used to prepare the drink kawa or awa. The roots are either chewed or ground and then mixed with water to produce a calming effect. This effect is caused by the kava-lactones contained in the root. In addition to its use in kawa, the pepper root is also employed for medicinal purposes, such as relieving stress, sleep disorders, or pain. It is an integral part of Polynesian tradition and culture.
When they returned to the ship, they found it surrounded by numerous canoes. Pigs and a large quantity of bananas had been brought for trade from different parts of the island. The fear caused by the violent incident involving the crew had now been forgotten, and the locals came aboard in great numbers. They spoke familiarly with the sailors and were clearly delighted by everything they saw on the ship. As much as they had pushed aside the memory of the incident, some began stealing again whenever an opportunity arose. However, when caught, they returned the stolen items without hesitation. Often they danced on deck to the sailors' delight, and their dances closely resembled those of Tahiti. Their music also shared many similarities, especially their drums, which were like the ones already known and acquired in Tahiti. The islanders' canoes were small, but built similarly to those on Tahiti. The prow often featured an upright piece of wood, decorated with a roughly carved face. The sails were made of triangular mats that were wide at the top. The paddles were made of hard wood, short, pointed at the bottom, and had a knob at the top. In the afternoon, Georg remained on board to sort the plants and other materials collected so far. In the evening, the other members of the expedition returned. They had spent the afternoon exploring 2 bays south of the harbor, but found them unsuitable for ships. In stormy weather, they offered little protection, and landing was dangerous due to the heavy surf. Still, their efforts had been rewarded with an abundance of food and the successful purchase of pigs. The inhabitants in those bays appeared less reserved than those in their harbor. Among them were also some women who behaved with the same friendliness as the women on other South Sea islands. The women were smaller than the men, but well proportioned. Some had facial features and figures that reminded them of the noble women of Tahiti. Their skin tone was generally similar to that of the common people in the Society Islands, but unlike the men, they had no tattoos, which were widespread among the men and often disfiguring. One particularly graceful woman allowed herself to be portrayed by Mr. Hodges, and the image was later published as a copper engraving. The women wore clothing made of mulberry bark, though it was less varied than in Tahiti. Most wore only a simple mantle that reached from the shoulders to the knees. Jewelry was rare, apart from simple necklaces made of string. As the group was preparing to reboard the ship, a sailor was reprimanded by the captain for some misconduct. This caught the attention of the locals, who exclaimed, "Tapia hai tetena! He strikes his brother!" From this reaction, the crew concluded that the islanders considered them all as brothers, and perhaps even viewed their entire people as one single family. The political organization of the islanders appeared to be less developed than on Tahiti. King Honu enjoyed no special honors or privileges. His only distinction was that he wore full clothing, while many other men went about naked, either out of convenience or laziness in the tropical climate.
Sunday, April 10th, 1774, Tahuata, Marquesas Islands.
The next morning, the captain returned once more to the previously visited bay. But this time, trade was less successful. The inhabitants were still unfamiliar with the advantages and durability of the Europeans' iron goods, and therefore showed little interest in them. Instead, they asked for items that the crew could not easily spare. So, in the afternoon, the anchor was lifted, and the harbor of Madre de Dios was left behind after a stay of just under 4 days. During this time, the crew had taken on a considerable supply of fresh, excellent water and had received a valuable amount of provisions from the friendly and generous locals. In terms of natural history, however, little new was discovered, as the stay had been short and the islands appeared very similar to Tahiti and the neighboring island groups. The limited time also prevented a deeper acquaintance with the inhabitants, though they certainly deserved to be observed through the lens of philosophical reflection. It was especially regrettable that there was no opportunity to examine the fences on the mountains more closely. Georg continued to believe that they might be related to religious practices. The Spanish had spoken of an oracle which, based on their descriptions, seemed more like a burial site, similar to those found on the Society Islands. The crew estimated the total population of the islands to be relatively small, given the limited size of the land. Tahuata, San Cristina, measured about 15 kilometers in circumference, Hiva Oa, Dominica, 28 kilometers, Fatu Hiva, San Pedro, only 5 kilometers, and Magdalena, which they had only seen from a distance, was, according to Spanish reports, about 9 kilometers in circumference. Georg was convinced that the inhabitants of all the Marquesas Islands descended from common ancestors, just like the people of Tahiti and the Society Islands. This assessment was based on the interactions and conversations they had, especially with the inhabitants of Tahuata and Hiva Oa. Although the inhabited areas of the Marquesas Islands supported a considerable population given the amount of fertile land, the many dry and inaccessible rocky regions posed a significant obstacle to greater population density. Overall, the crew estimated the population of the Marquesas at no more than 50,000 people. Hiva Oa, the largest island in terms of area, was likely less densely populated than the smaller Tahuata, due to its harsh and mountainous terrain. The Spanish, who were the first to discover these islands, found the inhabitants kind-hearted, friendly, and peaceful. Apart from a minor conflict on Fatu Hiva, which was likely the result of a misunderstanding or the usual impulsiveness of the sailors. We too were received with every sign of friendship upon our arrival. They offered us pepper roots and branches from the tamanu tree, calophyllum, inophyllum, lin, as symbols of peace, sold their foodstuffs, and remained friendly even after the death of one of their people. They allowed us to move freely through their land. Their behavior, customs, impressive physical stature, clothing, food, seafaring practices, and language all suggest that they share the same origin as the Tahitians. Differences between them are mainly due to the distinct nature of the respective islands. The inhabitants of the Marquesas lack the advantage of large plains, such as those found on Tahiti or the other Society Islands. They possess only as much land as is necessary to grow their essential food, which is why the extensive mulberry plantations so common on Tahiti are absent here. Even if they had suitable soil, the demands of their more labor-intensive agriculture would leave little time for maintaining such plantations. There is no abundance of food or clothing on the Marquesas as there is on Tahiti. Yet the islanders are not lacking in what is necessary. What they do have is a greater degree of natural equality. There are no social constraints that diminish their happiness or keep them from living in harmony with nature. They are healthy, full of life, and of striking physical build. While the Tahitians enjoy more comforts and a higher level of craftsmanship that make their lives more pleasant, the original equality among social ranks has significantly deteriorated. The nobility already live at the expense of the common people, and both the high and the low pay for their indulgences, with illnesses and other visible ailments. After a 5-month voyage that had taken them from the frozen zone at the 71st degree of latitude to the hot regions as far north as 9.5 degrees south, the Marquesas Islands were the first place where they once again received meat and fruit for refreshment and nourishment. The small supply of sweet potatoes they had obtained on Easter Island had, under divine providence, delayed the outbreak of various illnesses. But that protection lasted only until they re-entered the hot climate. Then their blood, which had become sluggish and sharp from the cold, fell into a harmful fermentation. Given the pale and emaciated condition of the entire crew, it was high time they reached the Marquesas Islands. Had they arrived any later, scurvy and other diseases would undoubtedly have taken a dreadful toll. In this context, they publicly praised Mr. Patton, their esteemed ship's surgeon. As far as human foresight, medical skill, and a compassionate heart could reach, he took the best possible measures to keep the crew as healthy as circumstances allowed. He proposed the most suitable methods to the captain, oversaw their implementation tirelessly, and did everything within his power. It can truthfully be said that many owed their survival to his care and the grace of God. England thus owed him the preservation of many valuable and capable men who had been sent on this hazardous expedition. Captain Cook also deserved recognition, as he never failed to try any suggestion that offered even the slightest chance of success. The health of the crew was essential to the success of the entire voyage, and it was to Cook's great credit that he gave this matter special attention, especially since many other naval commanders often neglected or ignored it altogether.
That brings us to the end of episode 40 of Georg Forster's journey around the world about the HMS Resolution under the command of Captain James Cook. A map with the key locations from this episode is linked in the show notes. If you'd like to see how these places look today, visit my YouTube channel Voyage to Go, where I trace Forster's path and explore the echoes of history in the present day. Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next part of our expedition. If you enjoy the podcast and want to support my work, you'll find the PayPal link in the show notes. The journey continues, and I'd love to have you along for the next chapter, because life is a journey. Being part of it is everything.